Good morning, everyone. Welcome to House Economic Matters Committee. Today is January 25th, 2022. This morning, we have two briefings. The first is from the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research, and then the second is from the Maryland Department of Labor with Secretary Robinson. I just want to remind everybody, please make sure that you are on mute. Additionally, ensure that your display name is correct. And then after each presentation, we will have questions, and I'll just call on people as their hands go up in that order. So first off, I would like to welcome Mr. Christopher OLeary, who's a senior economist at the Upjohn Institute. Mr. OLeary, did you want to go ahead and share slides?
Yes, I would like to. Thank you. Shall I begin?
The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. I'm happy to meet with the committee from the House of Delegates today. I presented this talk to the Joint House-Senate Committee a few weeks ago. And let's see here, put it into full screen.
You just hit F5.
There we go.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Let me move this over here. And we went through the whole thing pretty much, except for the supplementary material. So I think the slides have been circulated, is my guess. And I'd like to go through the first part pretty quickly because it recaps the high points, and it'll be a refresher for those who saw it before, but then get into some of the supplementary material. My colleague Ken Klein is on personal time off right now, so he can't join us, but I hope to answer any questions you have after Secretary Robinson speaks. So here's a little outline, talk about the background on Maryland unemployment insurance benefits and financing, standards for adequate benefits, what they are objectively, costs for improving Maryland benefits if we did approach the standards, what is a regressive tax? That issue came up, and when talking about reforming benefits, of course you have to pay for them. And would that be a regressive change? We'll see. A baseline simulation is where we start, assuming all the changes that took place, or given all the changes that took place in 2021. And then we do some simulations to change financing by indexing the taxable wage base, which has been at $8,500 since 1993. Eliminating UI tax schedule A, which was deliberated because going to that level seems to drop revenues too far, and I have some supplementary material on that. Triggers financing increased benefits. You know, we do some simulations of the cost of those benefits and then some simulations of what it would take to pay for them. We also consider the option of employee taxes, which is done in your neighboring state of Pennsylvania when they have a financial crisis, and done nearby state of New Jersey all the time, and some effects of that, improving accuracy and efficiency and preventing UI fraud. Some comments on that, which is always important. Then the supplementary material. So the Maryland benefit formula replaces 54% of high quarter base period earnings. So employers, as you know, in the state report earnings quarterly. And so benefit eligibility is determined on a quarterly basis. And if you take the high quarter, that's the quarter in the prior year that people probably had the closest to their full-time regular hours. And if you take 1/24, you're taking essentially 54% of the average of 13 weeks in that quarter. So that's a good replacement rate. It's higher than the standard. Historically, the maximum was increased every 3 or 4 years, but it hasn't been increased from $430 since 2010, getting on to 12 years. The minimum weekly benefit amount is rarely increased. It could be tied to an indexed maximum as a reform measure. Dependence allowance, $8 per dependent, $40 a week, has not been increased in almost 30 years. This is a chart of the average weekly benefit amount in gray. This is gray. The taller bars are the maximum. So the maximum really drags the average up. These red bars is the minimum. And you see the minimum, well, the minimum was flat. It was increased to $50 in 2012. And it's been 10 years, but it was flat for a long time. And we can talk about the adequacy of $50 a week for anybody these days in any situation. And the dependence allowance, $8 hasn't been increased in 30 years. The averages for Maryland over time, the last 50 years, the average has really dropped from, this is an average maximum as a share of the average annual, average weekly wage should be. The weekly benefit amount maximum as a share of the average weekly wage in UI covered employment has dropped from about 48% down below 40%. The average weekly benefit amount has dropped from under 40% to about 30% and really dipped in 2020 when a lot of high wage people became unemployed during the pandemic. But you know, it was about 30%, dropped from 40% to 30%. That's a 25% drop in the average wage replacement rate. And remember now, in 2019, our data available were through 2019. We looked at data from for 5 years, well, ended in the first half of 2020. We looked at data from 2016 through the beginning of 2020 and based our analysis on that. So if you look at the taxation side of things, and you look at the average annual wage in the state, by 2019, it was about $60,000, about $1,100, $1,150 a week at that time. And you look at the taxable wage base was 6,000. In 83, it jumped to 7,000. In 93, it jumped to 8,500 and hasn't changed since. So as a share of all earnings in the state, the taxable wage base was 42% in 83. It was 32% in 93 when it was raised to 8,500. It's now below 15%, about 14% in 2019. I don't know what it is right now exactly, but I think it's continued to decline as a share of average wages in the state. That reduces the tax capacity of the system, and it's not a progressive move of taxation, it's a regressive move because it weighs more heavily on lower wage workers. The average tax rate paid by Maryland employers, just over 4%, or not quite 4%, let's think, not quite 4% on total wages. It puts Maryland in the lowest 20% of states. And the taxable wage base puts Maryland even farther to the right in the distribution of states. So some type of increase in the taxable wage base would be a progressive move. It would broaden the tax base and it could accommodate improvement in the system on the benefit side. Those of you who know the Maryland system know the tax, you see the tax tables in section 8-612, and they're written out in legal terms, but if you graph them as an economist would, the lowest Schedule A is this blue line that has a maximum here at about, what is it, seven, this is the tax rate, 7.5%. And this maximum here is, I think, 12.5 or 13.5%. But these tax schedules shift up as the reserve positions go down. There's schedules A through F. Discussion was, should we eliminate A so we don't go as far? There's paragraph F in the UI section on taxation, which says you can't drop down there if the average high cost multiple is less than 1.0, and we'll explain that. This dark line in the graph is the distribution of taxable wages in the state. The taxable wages are measured here in millions, so that's $5 billion, $4.5 billion, about $4.5 billion of Maryland wages are at that lowest rate. And the next tier is a lower proportion of taxable wages, and then there's a higher proportion. So these are the biggest proportion of taxable wages are at the bottom end of this tax schedules, no matter when. And the distribution of Maryland employers spreads out, and then there's a bump at the maximum level. What are the standards for benefits? Replacing 50% of prior earnings. Of course, Maryland replaces 54%. This balances adequate income replacement based on prior earnings and work incentives, not too high to be a disincentive to work. It's not so high as the FBUC was. Of course, the federal pandemic unemployment compensation of $600 or $300 was needed by all families, Maryland families and all families. And the system suspended work search requirements, so it didn't really have any effect on return to work in that temporary period. But benefits should always replace at least 50%. The maximum should be 2/3 of the average weekly wage in covered employment. That's a standard that's been around since Dwight Eisenhower in the 50s enunciated it. This assures that 80% of beneficiaries get the 50% wage replacement. Now in Maryland, like I said, in 2019, only 50% of beneficiaries were getting the maximum. So, you know, the below 50% were getting the 54% wage replacement, but above the $430, all those earners who had earnings, average weekly earnings above about $800 a week, $796 a week, were getting a smaller wage replacement. And the minimum has been neglected for 30 years. You could index it. We did a simulations based on indexing it to 1/4 of the maximum. You could pick a different parameter if you wanted. We could provide, you always provide 26 weeks. That's good. It's sufficient time for job search. This is the current system as I described. Here are some reform options that we simulated. 1/26 of high quarter earnings instead of 1/24 would be a 50% wage replacement. That would reduce benefits somewhat, but it would it could allow you to spread the pool for paying benefits over a broader spectrum. You could raise the dependence allowance to $25 per dependent with a total allowance capped at $100 instead of a total of $40. This is what we simulated. You could index the maximum to 2/3 of the average weekly wage, or set the maximum at $775 with or without a dependence allowance. And this is a rule that some states have. You could pick a different multiple. you could index the weekly benefit amount to the minimum to 25%. This is where it would be. So we simulated the cost of these things. The simulated average weekly benefit amount under the current system is $374. That's the average across all beneficiaries in our data for 2019. The average, sorry, this is the benefits paid. What am I saying? This is the baseline benefits paid, 374 million. And if we raised the, if we adopted these rules, 2/3 times the average weekly wage and 50% wage replacement, the average weekly benefit amount would be $456. It would require a 37.6% increase in revenue to pay for that. If you, that's under the current wage replacement rate. If you lowered the wage replacement rate to 50% from 54%, and you index the maximum to 2/3 of the average weekly wage, the average weekly benefit amount would be $431. The cost would be this, be a 30% increase. Instead of 38%, it'd be a 30% increase. So the changing the rule for the benefit formula would save quite a bit, and that would actually pay for indexing the minimum or the dependence allowance. This package, which has the dependence allowance, index maximum, minimum, and the somewhat lower wage replacement rate, is about 35% overall. We estimated this with and without a behavioral response. If you raise benefits, people might search a little bit longer to find a better job, and that would boost the cost a little bit. I have points about the regressive tax. We went through that with the committee. A low fixed taxable wage base bears more heavily on employers paying lower wages and low wage workers. I was just at the economics meetings a few weeks ago, and there was a new paper on the effects of the fixed taxable wage base, and it bears most heavily on low wage workers who are multiple job holders. And based on observations, a study that looked at states that changed their tax base, when the tax base goes up, actually the demand for low wage workers goes up as well. And the other thing is that when the tax base is low and fixed, it essentially amounts to a head tax or like a poll tax, right? I mean, if you want to put a barrier to voting, you require people to pay, and people who can't afford to buy food don't vote because they have to buy food instead. It's a regressive system, and at $8,500, almost all the earners in the state, and with the minimum wage of $12.50, somebody earning, let's say, working 20 hours a week for a year, a regular part-time worker earning that minimum wage would earn $12,500. They'd qualify for a benefit if they became unemployed of about $130. Somebody in a average wage job at $60 an hour, they'd be qualified for the maximum benefit. But somebody even at a $20 an hour job would qualify for the maximum if they worked 40 hours a week. And so maybe the part-time worker has to work 2 jobs and they pay in twice. And that's another principle of finance in economics, is that the workers indirectly bear the cost through lower wages. Employers directly pay the tax, but there's evidence, and particularly when the tax base is fixed for a long time, the mechanisms in the wage setting in the labor market tend to result in a pass-through of the tax burden. The baseline economic assumptions are these, you know them. Their economic conditions, labor force growth, the existing tax base, the tax schedules, the shifting to Schedule C through the infusion of $1 billion. So this is the baseline simulation. So let me just talk to you a little bit about this. Here we are, 2022. The year-end trust fund balance was positive at the end of 2021. This is where the $1 billion infusion came in. And without that, you wouldn't be at an average high cost multiple over 1 here. And you wouldn't be on C, Schedule C. So this magic happened because of the CARES and the Recovery Act funding that was infused. And it relieved Maryland employers for the recovery period. And the question will be when to reconstruct the financing system that was bailed out this one time. This measure, the average high cost multiple, I talked about it last time. What it is, and you have it in your paragraph F in the tax table section of your act. And your standard there is 1.0. And what that means is, are there reserves in the system sufficient to pay 1 year of benefits at a recession rate? And what this says is that there's 1.12 years of benefits, so about 14 months worth of benefits. And this is what will happen under your current system if you do nothing and keep the benefit structure and so forth as it is. You gradually erode reserves. If you start indexing in 2023 and you from $8,500, the taxable wage base would start to gradually increase from 85 to 87, 89, and so on, to be 10,600 in 10 years. The effect would be not sufficient to change the pattern of funding for the system. So starting at 8,500 is not going to do it, even if you don't change and increase benefit generosity at all. If you bump the base up by $1,500 and then start indexing it, you're over the high cost multiple, but it's not enough to pay for enhanced benefits, really, for the forthcoming years. If you indexed it to 25% of the average weekly wage, which is a lower fraction than any states that index, and of course, it's, remember, lower fraction, 25% is lower than the proportion of taxable wages in 1993, or certainly in 1983, when it's 42%, you would build reserves. And this would be sufficient to pay for enhanced benefits. This is a table that shows you the states that have formulas in place for the indexation of the taxable wage base. And the average high cost multiples of those states. And you can see that the rules for indexation, 75% of the average annual wage, 100%. And the simulations that I ran are 25%. No states that actually index it have such a low. New Jersey, your nearby state, indexes it to 54% of the average annual wage. So they have a taxable wage base of $34,400. So anyway, that's kind of what the other states, some of the other states are doing. So let's continue. So here's some microsimulation results of based on the data that we have 2016 through the middle of 2020, indexing the taxable wage base to 25% of the average annual wage. The effect on taxable wages of Maryland experience rated employers and small and medium employers. It would increase taxable wages by 54%, but because taxable wages are in the denominator of the benefit ratio will go down. So people would move down along those tax tables, but the tax rates only go down by 14% through that movement. So the product of the increased taxable wages and total tax payments would be this. Of course, tax tables could be adjusted, could be lowered further if the taxable wage base were indexed. And they're all parameters in the same system, and they can be all moved. The tax payments per employee, the increase would be $31 throughout the state, $32 for the small and medium employers who pay higher wages. These are the various scenarios that I just showed you tables for. These are the benefit improvements that we describe. These are simulations with the average weekly benefit amounts increasing. So here we show the average weekly benefit amounts in the simulation with dependence allowance, simulation weekly benefit amounts, the indexed maximum, the average, add the index minimum. This is the add the index maximum and the dependence allowance. This is what the weekly benefit amounts would change to. So they would be going from, 2023, an average of 346 to 839. The 504, 511, 520. These are the averages here. This is the simulation with a taxable wage base, 25% of the average weekly wage without an adjustment for behavioral response. The tax schedule that would be in effect with no behavior and the average high cost multiples would be this. If there's a behavioral response, it would be this. So if you index the taxable wage base and you increase the benefit generosity, it would pay for it. This is just one scenario here. Let's see. The eliminating the tax schedule A would get it, but this doesn't pay for the increased benefits. No tax schedule A with increased benefits. You see, it goes red in 2024, and you start jumping up on the tax schedules. So taxing individual wage earners, what about that? So New Jersey has the highest recipiency rate in the nation. It's 52%. That is, as a proportion of all unemployed, 52% of the people in New Jersey receive unemployment benefits. They know that it's social insurance. It's not welfare. They pay a tax. They pay 0.425% on their earnings up to that maximum that we showed you is about $38,000. It's a broader tax base. But they have a higher recipiency. The Maryland recipiency rate's about 27%. The average yearly cost with a taxable wage base of a tax rate of 0.3%, which is the minimum on your tax schedule, would cost the average worker $22.28. It would give workers a bigger seat at the table in negotiating changes, and it would raise about $60 to $70 million in revenue per year. If you had index taxable wage base tied to 25% of the average weekly wage, it would average about $36.90 per earner in 2019. And the maximum that anybody would pay would be $45 over the whole year. And these are some simulations, the UI tax revenue that would result from the employee tax. It's about $442 million. With the employee tax, it would raise baseline revenue by 57. Oh, it would raise, no, the employee additional tax would be 57 million. This would be the addition paid by employees over this period. And I'm trying to get through a lot of stuff here. And I probably, let me know if I'm going over time, but let me just jump to a couple of things. These are the employee revenue. We can talk about that. Improving access and integrity. Yes, I think Secretary Robinson will address these things, and I agree with many of the things she will say. These are the policy options that we talked about. These are things we didn't talk about. Without the $1 billion infusion, what would have been? The average wage rate distribution of employers in the state, which you should look at. It's useful for making your plans. The industry distribution, the employment size distribution, and some questions that you raised in your legislation about seasonal employment and costs of non-charging. This is the baseline without the infusion. The average high cost multiple would have been very low and the tax schedules would have been very high. The old baseline without the $1 billion, again, very high. The average high cost multiples with neither the 1 billion nor the non-charging. If you had the indexed 8,500, a 20% taxable wage base tied to 20% of the average weekly wage, 25% as we suggested, or 33%. And these are the differences. Like I said, indexing from 8,500 doesn't get you there. The 20% doesn't quite get you there. And the 25% would, and this would pay for benefit improvements. The non-charging and so forth, this tells you what the tax schedules would be under each of those indexations. We did some analysis of the triggers, and if you look at the tax triggers, the trigger to go to Schedule A is to drop from Schedule B to Schedule A is that reserves must exceed 5% of taxable wages. But remember, taxable wages are only 14% of total wages. So that tax Schedule A triggers 7% of total wages. It's not 5% sounds like a pretty high trigger, but it's only 7% of total wages. So you don't really guarantee anything about the 1.0 average high cost multiple. You'd have to have a trigger on taxable wages of 8.6% by this simple extrapolation. And, you know, it just raises the question of setting triggers with a declining tax base when the triggers were set a long time ago. This is
Mr. OLeary.
Yeah.
Mr. OLeary, I'm not trying to interrupt, but can we start to wrap this up? We still have to get to Secretary
Sure.
Robinson.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Crosby. Let me just show you the industry distribution and look at the earnings per employee. Utilities pay high, wholesale trade pays high, information sciences pay high, company and enterprise management, high earnings per employee. These are the companies that would be impacted most by raising the taxable wage base. These are the companies that, the industries that would be impacted least: educational services, food, hotel and restaurant, hospitality, retail, trade. These would all be impacted least And this shows the tax payments per employee. You should see this, the distribution of employers. This is all the records over 5 years. 20% of all the Maryland employers, 25% maybe, well, 20% are one employee. 2 employees, 30% of all employers. And look at the average wages. The smallest employers pay the highest wages. The lowest wages are in this range of employment size, 5 to 9, 10 to 19, 20 to 50. And the biggest unemployment you can see is in this range. Tax payments are biggest in this range because the unemployment experience is in that range. These are just things to keep in mind because these questions always come up. The seasonal employment is a very small issue that we identified in your data, given your current rules. We can talk about that more. And expanding UI covered employment for work sharing or PUA, we didn't have the data to look at that. We could do it in the future. We're going to be getting those data for our evaluation of reemployment services for unemployed, and that may be something that we can do. The work sharing is a relatively small program in Maryland too, but we can talk about that more. Non-charging or partially charging for that would be a good incentive. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Leary. Secretary Robinson, I know that I think we talked to Andrew before we came on, and we're going to share your slides, so you can just let us know when you want us to change them.
That would be great. Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I got you. It's great to see you. I know you've been on.
Great to see you as well, Vice Chair Crosby and members of the committee. My understanding is that Chair Wilson might be caught in another meeting, but I did have a chance to meet with him last week, and I value those conversations and hope that he can be part of the follow-up as well. For the record, my name is Tiffany Robinson, and I'm Secretary of the Maryland Department of Labor. I wanted to just thank you for the invitation and give a special thank you to Committee Counsel Erica White for coordinating it all. If you'd like, you can go ahead and put the slides up. Before I begin, I did just want to take a minute to acknowledge how heavy our hearts are right now. I think you all know that our main offices and buildings are located in Baltimore City, and we have benefited many times from the bravery and courage of Baltimore's finest firefighters and first responders. So before I started, I just, on behalf of the Maryland Department of Labor, I wanted to express our deepest sorrow and condolences to the entire fire department and to the families of the firefighters who made the ultimate sacrifice yesterday. Our thoughts and prayers are with them. And with that, I'm happy to get started if you want to put the slides on the screen. And while they're coming up, I do just want to also say thank you to Dr. O'Leary. You'll hear in the beginning of my presentation that we worked closely with Chris and his partner Ken in this process, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to have all of this data for our department and for you. These programs are complex, and I know you had a lot of questions last legislative session, all of which I was not able to answer. And I think that this data and analysis gives the General Assembly a lot to work with.
Thank you. Hey, Kayla, can you bring up the slides? Oh, there we go.
Those look like Dr. O'Leary's slides.
Just shift the tab, I think, there, because you had them both open in that application.
I'm so sorry, guys. Give me a second. It's not showing up on my files to be able to share. So give me a moment.
Secretary Robinson, do you have the slides? Maybe we can make you a co-host and you can just share it.
I do.
I have them pulled up. If I don't know if I'm able to, I can try and do that right now.
Oh, Andrew, that would be fantastic.
So
It always takes me a minute to remind myself it's different sharing documents on all the different virtual platforms these days. Thank you, Andrew, or whoever put them up. Great. We can go ahead and move right to the next slide. I know everyone's waiting, so I'm going to jump right in. My first slide, when we turn to it, is really just kind of a statistical update on what we've kind of faced since the beginning of COVID-19 in these last couple of years. I do want to point out that our department has received nearly 3 million new unemployment insurance claims. As you can tell, that's nearly half of our population. Many of those claims are fraudulent, but our team still has to investigate every single one. I'm going to jump down and also and kind of move around in these bullets, because I also want to point out that during this time frame, during the pandemic, we increased the UI funding in the unemployment insurance division by more than $200 million, adding 2,225 new unemployment insurance employees between our call center, our adjudication team, and our state staff. And the reason I point that out first is because those employees in our department, new and existing, have just done an incredible job. And I would be remiss if I didn't take a moment to say how proud I am of what they have, how hard they've worked overtime for 2 years straight. And that hard work has resulted in 99% of non-fraudulent completed claims receiving an initial determination and being processed. And that only leaves 1%, a little over 9,000 claims that have not yet received an initial determination. I think that's important for everyone to recognize. Have we made mistakes along the way? Absolutely. Hindsight is a beautiful thing that I didn't have the benefit of 2 years ago. But our employees have worked really hard, and we have focused on our customer. And I think we've come a long way, and we're going to get through this with your partnership. It's also important to note that 1.7 million claims, and that that accounts for 1.7 million claimants, and 2.3 million claims have been flagged for fraud. It's a really important statistic, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it later in the slides. And maybe most important of all is that we have paid over $14.5 billion in state and federal benefits. That helps our customer, and that helps this economy. And then the last bullet is important for the rest of this presentation, because what it shows you is that our unemployment insurance trust fund balance currently is higher than it was pre-pandemic. And that's due to a lot of the things that Dr. O'Leary talked about and that I'm going to talk about as well. So we can move to the next slide. And really, I just wanted to kind of start with a 2021 review. Dr. O'Leary mentioned some of these things as well, but I did want to remind you and thank you for working in such a bipartisan manner last session to coordinate and ease the impacts of to employers and the state's unemployment insurance trust fund. We did this, we know, by securing a nearly $1 billion infusion of American Rescue Plan money into the unemployment insurance trust fund. That was historic and something that no other state did to that magnitude. We also codified the non-charging of 2020 experience for employers through 2023. We secured or are holding employers in Table C for 2022 and 2023. And of course, we offered employer payment plans and tax deferment options, which also helped employers over these past couple of years. So we can go to the next slide. I won't take very long on this one. This one just leads us right to House Bill 907, which is the study on systems reforms. And just wanted to make sure everyone understood that in order to conduct this study envisioned by the bill, we contracted with Upjohn Institute in coordination with the Jacob France Institute at University of Baltimore. And while Upjohn and JFI did independent research and simulations to provide the report that Dr. OLeary just walked us through, the Maryland Department of Labor researched and analyzed items 4 and 5 of that bill. So we'll walk through all of that in my next few slides. So we can go to the next one. And I want to point out that in my opinion, the highlight of this analysis that is in this report is that the state's unemployment insurance trust fund is currently in a financially sound position for the coming years. Again, these are due to the bipartisan actions taken in 2021. This is also due to most employers having paid their unemployment insurance taxes in a timely manner over the past year. That's a big deal. It's also due, I would add, to the vigilance of our state employees in investigating and blocking fraud in our system. So again, our trust fund balance currently is higher than it was pre-pandemic. We can go right to the next slide. I'm going to highlight a couple of the same charts that Dr. OLeary showed you. I just wanted to point out that the black arrow in this chart indicates that the fund is was solvent by the end of 2021 due to the combination of employers paying in Table F and the American Rescue Plan infusion. And the yellow line shows you that solvency remains through 2025 if all else remains the same. And of note, you can see that employers under these circumstances will be back to Table A in 2024. So we can go to the next slide. So the central finding of the Upjohn and JFI report really is suggested UI financing reform. Upjohn and JFI suggested indexing Maryland's taxable wage base to 25%. But this reform would account for a significant tax for Maryland employers. And in turn, that would bring greater revenue to the trust fund. The report suggests that by indexing the taxable wage base, the state may be better suited to maintain fund solvency into the future years beyond 2025. And this policy recommendation would represent a 20.7% unemployment insurance tax increase on Maryland employers. So we can go to the next slide. I also just wanted to highlight that something else that Dr. OLeary pointed out was the taxable wage base indexing would impact small and medium-sized enterprises in Maryland more than the average employer because increasing their UI taxes by an average of 25.3%, which represents an additional $32 per employee on average. And this is really because small and medium-sized enterprises in Maryland on average pay 1.2% higher wages than the average employer. So we can move to the next slide. The benefit eligibility standards were one of the portions of Bill HB 907 that the department studied internally. Studying the establishment of clear standards for when an employment is entitled to claim unemployment. If the employee leaves a job due to unsafe working conditions, or if there's an unreasonable risk of infection, or if they're terminated for refusing to work in unsafe conditions, or if they decline to accept work due to unsafe work conditions. So if you go to the next slide, I wanted to note that generally standards are guided by Maryland statute and USDOL program rules. You've probably heard me talk many times about unemployment insurance program letters, or UPLs, as they are called by anyone that works in the unemployment insurance world across the country. Maryland Department of Labor did conduct a full review of all standards and has updated its directives to address lessons learned from this pandemic. We will evaluate separations initiated by employees' refusal to work because of unsafe working conditions or because of an unreasonable risk at a work site on a case-by-case basis. And these are under best practices nationwide. And it's really important to note that when we evaluate whether a claimant had good cause to refuse work or quit a job due to hazards on a work site, our division gives great weight to the guidance issued by the relevant authority, which in these circumstances would be the CDC, USDOL, OSHA, or the Maryland Occupational Safety and Health Division. So we can go to the next slide. The bill also asked us to research and report out on existing fraud penalties. And the penalties currently in effect for committing unemployment insurance fraud by statute are not to exceed a $1,000 fine, 90 days in prison, and or disqualification from receiving benefits in the future. These portions of the law dictating fines and penalties for fraud have not been updated since 1986. That was the Reagan administration. So if we move to the next slide. I think everyone knows, because you've heard me say it so many times and you've seen all of the stories in Maryland and nationwide about the number of fraudulent claims we have faced. A snapshot from March to 2020 to December 2021 shows that 2,318,285 claims were flagged for fraud. That's historic, and it's the same thing that's happening nationwide, unfortunately. The policies related to the COVID-19 pandemic made stopping and catching fraudsters a more difficult task than usual. We know that the CARES Act programs led new claims to skyrocket, which led to a national increase in the amount of fraud investigations. But something that I don't think anyone expected, including USDOL or the Office of Inspector General or the FBI that we work with so often these days in these fraud investigations, I don't think they realized that we would be experiencing the new type of fraud across the country, which is identity theft. And the infusion of fraud rings from global sectors attacking our systems. Some of the programs, actually, we can go to the next slide. Before I get to that, sorry, I forgot which slide was next, but I just wanted to point out that some of the CARES Act programs that allowed, that were written to allow PUA and self-employed workers to estimate their income created difficulty for states in combating fraud. Because by the time USDOL came out with rules on how states were to confirm or verify any income or employment that had been estimated, oftentimes those claimants had been paid too much. As you can imagine, fraudsters took lots of advantage of any ability to estimate in our system. So let's move to our recommendations, because the report asked us for this as well. I want to point out that given the trust fund's projected solvency through 2025 and the regressive nature of many of the recommendations, the department does not endorse or recommend a higher tax burden on Maryland employers at this tenuous economic time. I can tell you that I have heard from many employers across the state of Maryland. I'm imagining you have as well. And they're still struggling. We're facing a labor shortage, having that same experience in the Maryland Department of Labor as we continue to try and hire. They are, in the midst of, we're in the midst of another Omicron surge. We just feel strongly, and I want to be on the record stating that while I don't disagree with any of the very complex data that's been presented, we don't believe that now is the time to increase taxes on our employers. We all worked so hard in such a bipartisan manner to essentially provide a life raft for employers during the pandemic with an infusion of funding into the trust fund and non-charging for experience rating. And it wouldn't make sense right now as they are still struggling to emerge strong and stable from this pandemic to impose a tax increase on them. However, my second bullet does recommend that we use this information that's been provided to us by Upjohn and JFI to study it. Let's get extensive stakeholder input before implementing any financing reforms on the state's unemployment insurance system. We hope to partner with you in doing that in the coming months and years. I would also like to recommend something I recommended last year, which is suspending the mitigation language in our statutes to move Maryland to a pay or deny model during times of extreme emergency to allow for expedited claims processing. We know that would benefit our customer and it would make the job more streamlined for my staff. We'd also like, as I mentioned in an earlier slide, for you to consider enhanced penalties for fraudulent activity in the system to better protect legitimate claimants and employers from what has been an onslaught of sophisticated fraud. So with that, we can move to the next slide, because I know the committee had also asked for an update on 2021 legislative implementation. I think you all know that the administration and legislature made significant reforms to the UI system during the 2021 General Assembly that were meant to aid claimants, employers, and the department in addressing this crisis. So HB 907 is what resulted in the production of the systems reform study and related analysis that we just spent so much time talking about. House Bill 908 allowed the department to expand its payment plan options to employers who may have needed financial aid as a result of the crisis. I will note that our department found that most employers over the course of the last year paid their unemployment insurance taxes on time and without taking advantage of the payment plan options. Although I will tell you that many employers did take advantage of the ability to defer payments until the fourth quarter. So if we move to the next slide, House Bill 1138 called for the department to produce unemployment related data on varying intervals, yearly, quarterly, monthly, and weekly. So currently, our new system does provide a wide range of unemployment insurance data, and our department is working to ensure that this data represents the relevant information intended by the legislature. We have created a web page that is updated weekly. There are some links on this page to USDOL data because it is the same data requested by this bill. So instead of reinventing the wheel, we link you to the page that provides the Maryland data on USDOL's site. There are some data queries that we are still working through. They are complex, and I would note that we provide over 150 reports to USDOL on data every year. And so some of these overlap and are slightly different. We look forward to working with the chairs of this committee and of the Unemployment Insurance Oversight Committee. And I know I've spoken to members about this. It's an ongoing effort by my team, and we hope to improve it to make sure that we are fully transparent and everybody is able to access all the data that they're looking for. House Bill 1139 called for the department to adjust the weekly benefit amount income disregard trigger within the Beacon system from $50 to $200. This was probably the most complex programming required by all of the legislation passed last year. And so we are working with our vendor to complete this. It's similar to the implementation of the federal lost wages assistance program last summer, where we needed an end date to the state of emergency to be able to provide eligible claimants with a lump sum payment. Again, it's a work in progress. We hope to have that done sooner rather than later. I don't think any of us expected the pandemic to last quite this long. But again, we're focused on our customer. We're focused on getting through every single claim in our system, and we're focused on meeting the intent of every piece of this legislation. So we will continue to update the committee as this is completed. We can move to the next slide. House Bill 1143 expanded the department's ability to enter into work sharing agreements with Maryland employers. This was a critical tool during the pandemic, and it allowed many employers to retain their employees without significant loss or financial burden. You can see the number of participating employers, active plans, and total number of employees from the chart during the pandemic. Those numbers are a little bit lower now, but as we emerge from the pandemic, but I will tell you that pre-pandemic in 2018-19, the number of participating employers in our work share program was in single digits. So this was a vast improvement, and the marketing and the work that was done under this bill to make changes to our work sharing program was a big payoff. We averted nearly 4,000 potential layoffs via this program. So we can move to the next slide. House Bill 1002 enacted several UI system reforms to benefit Maryland claimants. One thing it did was enable the Department of Labor and the Maryland Health Benefits Exchange to coordinate better in providing UI claimants with the ability to request information on free and low-cost health insurance options when they file a claim. We have MOUs in place with the Health Benefits Exchange now. We are working collaboratively toward completing this because of the timing of open enrollment. We agreed that the final launch of this functionality should be completed later this year in 2022. Or later this spring, I should have said, not at the end of the year. The Department of Labor is currently also working with local workforce development boards to provide them with the unemployment insurance data that will allow them to better target their resources to this population. We also have many MOUs in the works and being signed and in place already with local workforce development boards. And this is timely and more important than ever before because I'm working with those boards very closely to make sure that the customers get access to the highest investment of state workforce development funding, I think, in the history of our department. As you all know, $75 million funneled from the legislature to our department last year and directly to local workforce areas. So this data will be more important than ever before. Maryland Department of Labor has also created under this bill the Office of the UI Ombudsman. We've updated many communication procedures, and we've added new beacon system features to provide for improved experience to unemployment insurance claimants. Of course, this is something that we work every day to improve. And so we hope that this work will be ongoing as well. And the next slide, I think I wanted to simply end with a reminder of Senate Bill 811 that enacted several reforms that were critical to ensuring the future health of the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. As I've already mentioned, this bill is what allowed the infusion of a historic amount of rescue funds into the trust fund to ensure solvency and benefit both claimants and employers in years to come. Employers are not being charged on their experience rating for pandemic-related layoffs, and that was codified in Senate Bill 811. Employers will enjoy tax rates in Table C for 2022 and 2023, which benefits employers, and it also benefits our trust fund. And as a result, the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund is expected to remain solvent under the current circumstances through at least 2025, at the benefit of both Maryland employers and claimants. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And we'll take these, guys. The briefings were supposed to be over 11:30, so I'm going to keep that in mind, but we'll just go through, and if you can just keep the questions short as well as the follow-ups. First up, Delegate Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. And Madam Secretary, thank you for the work you've done over the past year. This has been unprecedented times. As an employer, I can relate directly to some of the challenges that I know you've faced as a department. Last session through the UI subcommittee, there was some discussion about apprenticeship programs and understanding where the Department of Labor can most positively impact people's ability to find work. And I know we're here talking about UI and unemployment insurance, which is the bridge between jobs, so to speak, and how do we help people in that regard. But I'm curious, where are the employment numbers, maybe in comparison to where we were before COVID, if you have that information? I'm sort of curious as to where our state is as far as, job numbers. And then more importantly, how have you found these apprenticeship programs and training programs for citizens? Are they being utilized? And then just curious as to your thoughts on those as a follow-up from last session as we were having similar discussions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Delegate Adams, for that question. I'm actually really proud to report to you that we have, for the second year running, even despite the pandemic, we still have over 11,000 registered apprentices in Maryland. That's a state record. We also, during the period of the pandemic, have registered 111 new apprenticeship programs. And there were another 31 previously inactive programs that were restarted during the pandemic. If nothing else, it shows that, our state workforce division has been working equally hard as our unemployment insurance division. And that's really important. You probably also know that the AMP, the Apprenticeship Maryland program, our youth program, is now in 22 of 24 jurisdictions, and we're working on those last two. A couple of those came on board during the pandemic as well, and it's really important for us to continue to market these programs and work with employers that are sponsoring them in the school system. We have this amazing partnership with the MSDE and with our employers to get students interested, and so that they can actually earn money and learn a trade and receive a certification in their junior and senior year of high school. So we're really proud of that, and we will keep pushing forward on those programs.
Thank you very much. And for the interest of time, I'll stop there. And as session moves on, I look forward to working with you in the department on legislation as I see it come forward.
Likewise, thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Adams. Delegate Shi.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair, and thank you, Secretary Robinson. First of all, I want to thank you for your team's responsiveness to our team's requests for resolving specific District 15 cases. My question has to do with this new Table C. Even though this fiscal year and the next fiscal year, businesses will be in Table C, which is a tremendous help, of course, it is still a sticker shock for a lot of small businesses, right? And I know you have already offered, delayed payments until 2022 and installments. I wonder if you have statistics of what percentage of small businesses are actually aware of and taken advantage of that.
So we've worked really hard to make sure all of our businesses are aware of this. We have email databases and press releases that have gone out about the expanded options for payment plans and the deferred payment options. We also work pretty closely with all of the employer organizations to get that information to them so they can push it out to their members. I don't have off the top of my head the utilization rate of the payment plans and the payment deferment, but I can certainly get that for you. As I mentioned in my slides, many more, even though we expanded our options on payment plans, essentially an employer can come to us, and if they don't meet kind of the one or two or three options of set payment plans that we offer, they can come to us with a plan, and we can actually create a plan for an individual employer. However, most employers that were looking for that financial break or needed more time, they did take advantage of the tax deferral method, waiting to pay until fourth quarter. And then, maybe a little bit to our surprise, we were really proud of our employer community for coming through and paying the vast majority of their unemployment insurance taxes by the required timeline at the end of the year. That's one of the reasons our trust fund is in good shape right now as well. So I'd be happy to follow up and get you those exact numbers.
Thank you. Before I go to Delegate Charkoudian, we'll do Delegate Aaron's and then Delegate Mouts, and then we'll finish up.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Thank you, Secretary.
Hold on 1 second, Delegate Aaron's. You're next. Delegate Charkoudian.
So you go to Delegate Aaron's. Okay.
Sometimes Delegate Aaron's thinks that he's me. It's like people get confused all the time. So it's, it happens. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Thank you for the presentation. I actually have a ton of questions. And so what I'm going to try to do is just post them on the record and ask you to follow up with all of us with the information. That way I won't take up too much of the committee's time. Sure. Most of these questions are related to my concerns about implementation of last year's legislation, a lot of which I'm worried still has not been implemented. So I'll start with HB 1138. You and I have had a chance to talk about that. I think there's a lot of data that is available that could be on that website for transparency that isn't. And so I just want to post that I think that that's still a huge area that needs to be addressed, and we can follow up. And I spoke with Delegate Carey yesterday, and we really want to make sure we get that transparency. So we'll follow up with that, but I just want to post that I think there's a lot still to do there for implementation.
Absolutely. We have the same goal, so I'm happy to work with you on that.
Thank you. The second thing is you said something about there had been this study, this question about leaving work for unsafe working conditions. And if I understood that slide, it looked like you said you have developed regs for clarity around that would then point to CDC recommendations, motion, OSHA recommendations. Is that something that we could see? Like, can we see the actual regs that have been developed or the guidance that's been developed for that? Like, can you?
Sure. I know it's not, I know those are not formal regulations. Those are internal directives for our staff that to guide as we train and adjudicate cases on a case-by-case basis. So let me circle back and see if I can get that to you.
Okay, thank you. Third, HB 1002 had a number of pieces in it that you didn't address. They're related to the standards of the timeliness of getting the first payment out. They're related to overpayment notices, and they're related to a few other things. So I know some of those things are part of a lawsuit against the department, and so you may not be able to speak specifically to them. I'm looking forward to the resolution of that lawsuit because I hope it'll lead to the implementation of the bill that we passed last year. But I'm just wondering if at some point in the future you can share more details on those points that you didn't share today related to 1002, either in a briefing or in writing later.
Absolutely, Delegate Charcuti, I'm happy to follow up. You're absolutely right. There are certain pieces of policy negotiations that are happening as part of federal lawsuit and federal court ordered mediation on some of those topics. That being said, we are anxious to make some of those changes, and many of them are already in the works. So as soon as I am able to report back and share publicly any of those changes that have been made, I will absolutely do that.
Okay, and finally, HB 907, I think also required part of the study was to look at how we might be able to take what was done during the pandemic of some kind of insurance for people who work in the gig economy. That's not the language we ended up using, but so like Uber drivers, so on. What sort of creative policy options there might be to help those folks that are a huge part of our economy right now. Did that get studied? I didn't see it in the Upjohn analyses, and I didn't think I saw it in the DOL analyses. I just didn't know if that got in the mix somewhere.
So, Delegate, I may have to get back to you on that. Dr. OLeary or Andrew, feel free to jump in if I missed something. We did have multiple conversations, not just myself on behalf of Maryland, but on behalf of my counterparts across the country. We had meetings with USDOL about whether or not there was any intent or plan to continue any of those pandemic programs for self-employed and gig economy workers. And the answer was no. There was not that intent at the current time. So without the federal programming and money to implement those programs, it's a very difficult thing to do, state by state. But that being said, I will circle back with my team and see if there was any part of the report or the study that I missed.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you,
Sure.
Mr. Vice Chair, Mr. Chair.
Delegate Aaron's.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Sorry, Delegate Charcuti, and sometimes I do get confused. Madam Secretary, thank you very much for being here. I have a bunch of questions, but I'm going to just hit you with one related topic, and that's going to be on the fraud. I know we've gone through a tremendous amount of anxiety over claims, and our offices have been inundated. I can't imagine, looking at these numbers, how much of that time that you all had to put in just to address the fraud. But I guess my point is on these things, when you mentioned something about penalties and stuff like that for committing this fraud, is that something the state does control, or is that combined with federal issues also?
So the penalties that I presented to you are Maryland state statute penalties. So obviously there is, like I said, global fraud happening, and there are much higher level authorities that are investigating this fraud. But the Maryland State Police, the U.S. Attorney in Maryland, our local police officers are also find themselves investigating individual circumstances of fraud. And so when anyone ends up in state court on those types of indictments, these are the penalties that would follow. And that is why we, as you can imagine, the current penalties in place have obviously not provided a deterrent for these activities. And so my recommendation was to change them simply because we need more of a deterrent in order to fight this, magnitude of fraud in our system.
Last part on that, have you come up with any guidelines on those deterrents, or are you expecting us to develop those for you?
Well, I wouldn't want to step in and supersede your role as the lawmaker, but I certainly would be happy to work with you and, possibly share some of the increased penalties from other states.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you.
Delegate Mouts.
Thank you. I'll try to be quick. Secretary, what's a reasonable expectation for a PUA overpayment appeal? An expectation for when that appeal would be resolved, and do you feel that you've got the resources to efficiently process the PUA overpayment appeals that have been filed?
Yes, our lower Board of Appeals and upper appeals boards operate within the Department of Labor, but independently. Obviously, the timelines for when appeals can be filed are regulatory and statutory at this time. As I mentioned earlier, the appeals process is specifically for overpayments is a topic of discussion in the federal lawsuit that I can't get into details on right now. But we are happy to work with all the partners in that case and with you as we move forward. And absolutely, if there are specific customers from your jurisdiction that you have concerns about, or the timeline, or you feel there's a lag, we would be more than happy to reach out to them directly and walk them through the timeline.
So most of this is part of that lawsuit that prohibits you from getting into the details?
That's correct. So let me back up. Remember, the CARES Act allowed PUA claimants to estimate their income. When they did that, our department then had to, after later USDOL guidance came, we had to go back into the system and ask them for documentation to prove their income. So down the road, once our staff would verify that actual income was much less than the estimated income, a claimant had oftentimes been overpaid. As you can imagine, that's due to no fault of the Maryland Department of Labor, but that's a claimant overestimating their income and potentially not understanding the programs. These programs were thrown out, and we, in record time to address a crisis. And we were also trying to help customers as quickly as we possibly could in this crisis. So with all the overpayments in, that is why the federal government then started allowing PUA waiver applications in our system. The eligibility for any claimant to have an automatic waiver is very, very limited. So the federal Department of Labor has explained to us that we must request a waiver application. And so we have tried to make sure every claimant that's eligible knows that they have the ability to file a waiver application. And we're being very liberal in granting those applications. So that's the best way for a claimant to start the process in dealing with an overpayment. But of course, if they need to appeal the denial of a waiver, then absolutely there's a timeline and process for that appeals process.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Again, I want to just thank Mr. OLeary and Secretary Robinson for coming here today. That is the end of these briefings. This afternoon, we're back at 1 p.m. We have 4 bills, 25 people signed up for oral testimony, and